In our look at the story of Jesus as recorded by the Apostle Matthew, founded in the first book of the New Testament called the Gospel of Matthew, we are at Matthew chapter 16. In the unit before us, we will just focus on one verse, Matthew chapter 16 and verse 13, reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" In Matthew's structure of the gospel, there is a shift in tone and direction following chapter 13. Chapter 13 of the Gospel of Matthew has a series of parables. And so, in that sense, the parables form a transitional point. The unit begins with the rejection of Jesus in his own hometown at the end of Matthew chapter 13. Then there is the murder of John the Baptist. Then there is Jesus walking on the water. Then there is more conflict with the religious leaders. There are the two feedings, the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. There are great things happening, and there are great forces reacting against him. In other words, Jesus could not do great things without there being an equal and opposite reaction against him. The disciples are becoming aware they are not just dealing with some prophet or teacher. The good times will roll theme of the early ministry is replaced with dark clouds on the horizon. The most basic question of life is, who is Jesus? Notice when this question is asked. It is not asked in Matthew's gospel until chapter 16. Could not have Jesus asked the question earlier? Were the disciples ready to answer the question earlier? Right there, we begin to see not only is this the most important question in life, who is Jesus, but it is also not just about the answer we give. Yes, the disciples could have been asked that question back in chapter 5, but they were not ready to answer the question. I think in this we have some very sound pastoral advice. Do not push people for an answer to the question of who Jesus is too soon. Let them see and experience who Jesus is. Let them begin to see what he is about, and let them begin to see what happens as Jesus is Jesus, and Jesus does what he does, because it's also about how people react against him. You will notice that Jesus uses the phrase the Son of Man in this verse. This phrase, to us especially, seems a little murky, but it seems to be that Jesus had a reason to do this. You see, Jesus had a dilemma that he faced in his ministry. Jesus came on the scene within a context. The Jewish people in the first century had, in the Promised Land, were living in an area controlled by the Romans. These people also at the same time had a tradition of a belief that a deliverer would come. Now notice there are two separate and distinct issues: the Roman control of the Promised Land and the promise of a deliverer. The danger that Jesus faced is that people would interpret the one in light of the other. In other words, they would see by necessity that any deliverer who came would be one who would deliver them from the Romans. In simple terms, the people's vision of things was too small, too limited. They saw that their need was only to be delivered from the Romans. They did not see their need to be delivered from the power of sin. Jesus could not claim right out to be the promised Messiah, for they would misunderstand what needed to be and what needed to be done. If Jesus had done that, they would have seen him through their expectations. Jesus does not want us to follow him on the basis of our own expectations. We have to come to see Jesus on his own terms, and in that sense, come to have expectations that are in line and in keeping with who Jesus is about. Jesus had to recast their expectations, and it seems that's why he used the term Son of Man. Yes, there is a sense in which it goes back to the book of Daniel and the promise of one who would come. But it was also a term that Jesus could fill with appropriate meaning. The challenge, therefore, was not for them to identify Jesus as Messiah. The challenge for them was to revise their understanding of who the Messiah was. In simple terms, the disciples already believed that the Messiah was coming. That was the problem. Their vision of who the Messiah was not the Messiah that Jesus would be. And the church today, people can often have a sense of who God is, or God the Father, or God the Son, and in some cases, maybe even God the Spirit or Holy Spirit. The issue is not whether people have some semblance of knowledge of who God is or therein. It is for them to begin to see and understand who God is. We may use creeds and we may sing songs about God, but that is not a substitute for our personal understanding of who God is. In fact, we can fail as a church if we settle for just letting people know of God in some sort of generic way. The church must be a place where we learn to refine our understanding of who Jesus is. People can be allowed in the church to hold on visions of God that are non biblical. It is important for us to truly understand who Jesus is. So, yes, this day we need to meditate on who he is and especially who he is to us.